Ready on the broadcasting side? Great. Good morning. Welcome to this session of the Welsh Affairs Committee in Committee Room 16. Delighted to welcome this morning former chairman of this committee and now the new Secretary of State for Wales, David T.C. Davies. Right Honourable, welcome. And your colleague, Dr. James Davies, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State and very recently appointed to the Wales office. So congratulations to you both and welcome. Delighted that you've given us your time this morning so soon into your time in office. Perhaps we can start straight away. I could start straight away by asking you, Secretary of State, just very briefly, and because we've got a lot of ground to cover this morning, I would implore you both and my colleagues asking questions, keep our remarks succinct and to the point. But can I ask you just to very briefly outline your priorities as the new Secretary of State? What is it that you want to achieve in your time at Gwydir House?
Mr Chairman, diolch yn fawr iawn am y gwahoddiad I ddod yma heddiw. Thank you very much. It was very important to us that we took the invitation, even though it was rather soon after we both had our appointment. In very simple and brief terms, in my role as Secretary of State for Wales, I hope to ensure that Wales has a very strong voice around the cabinet table, that the rest of government are fully aware of the needs of Wales. I want to make sure we get as much investment, and create as many jobs as we possibly can. I obviously am very enthusiastic about a couple of big potential projects that could come to Wales, about which I'm sure we're going to get asked later on, but essentially to make sure that Wales has a strong voice in government, and also that Wales is aware of the enormous commitment the UK government has towards Wales and its importance within the Union.
Did the Prime Minister give you a particular mission? Did he say, David, I want you to go out and do X, Y or Z?
The Prime Minister emphasised to all of us how important it was to display professionalism at all times. He certainly said to me that it was important that we develop a good and positive relationship with Welsh Government. And I was very pleased that I think the day after I was appointed, I was able to talk briefly to Mark Drakeford online in respect of another meeting, and I'm looking forward to having a proper one-to-one conversation with him today.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the essential role of the Wales office will continue as it has been? Is there any reason for us to suspect that there might be a difference in direction in terms of the role that you want to play as the Secretary of State, kind of with the seat at the cabinet table as a bit of a bridge into Welsh Government as well? I mean, is your feeling, because you've previously done the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State job and you've indeed sat in this chair as Chairman of the Welsh Affairs Committee, do you think that the role of the Wales office is recognised, established and therefore permanent?
I think there are two ways to answer that, Mr Chairman. I mean, obviously you and I have both been in Parliament for 17 years now, so we will have seen changes taking place, and you don't always notice them day to day, and obviously those changes will continue. But I get the feeling your question might be hinting at whether or not there is some suggestion that all of the territorial offices be rolled into one, which is an idea that seems to raise its head every couple of years. If that was the question, no, I don't see that happening. I think it's absolutely vital that the territorial offices remain in place and that both Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have their guaranteed place around the cabinet table. So obviously there'll be minor changes as there always are, but not a substantial change. I don't see that.
Okay, that's helpful. And Dr. Davies, I don't know whether you have had time between the two of you and with your officials to work out different portfolios within the office. I mean, Dr. Davies, are you able to kind of just give the committee a sense of what your priorities will be?
Well, diolch yn fawr, Mr Cadeirydd. It's good to be back at Welsh Affairs Select Committee, having been a member between 2015 and 2017, and a huge honour to have been made Parliamentary Under Secretary of State. So I have a steep learning curve, clearly. We have had preliminary discussions about how various topics might be divided up, which obviously will need to be approved at higher levels. But I see myself very much as supporting the Secretary of State and trying to be proactive and flying the flag for Wales at the UK government level.
Fabulous, thank you. Perhaps we can get into some specific issues now. Can I ask about free ports and investment zones? So when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, one of the new ideas that emerged was the idea of investment zones. It wasn't entirely clear to me, and I think perhaps other colleagues in the chamber, whether investment zones were to replace, displace, be welded onto free ports. So Secretary of State, can you give us a sense of, is this an idea that's now being dropped? Are we back to the pure free port idea that was in the manifesto in 2019? How should we see this area of policy, and specifically what implications does it have for Wales?
Obviously, as far as Freeport's concerned, as you'll be aware, Mr Chairman, the UK government have provided up to £26 million to get a Freeport up and running in Wales. There are bids in at the moment, and the bidding process is open until 24th of November, and we all look forward with great interest to see what's going to happen there. So that is going ahead. It seemed that there was a bit of a delay in terms of the discussions with Welsh Government, but that's all been resolved now and is moving ahead very well. So obviously, the Welsh Government recognised the potential for jobs and investment from having a free port, an area where a slightly different tax regime will apply. Obviously, the general idea is that things can be imported, that tax isn't paid until they're taken out of the free port zone, so manufacturing can take place, and if things are going back out again, then it creates jobs and investment for the area. So that is the principle of a free port. An investment zone works in a similar way, but with further freedoms, perhaps, in terms of taxes and planning. The question you really ask is that still going ahead? And as far as I'm aware, the answer is yes. I've heard reports, of course, that it might be being reviewed at the moment, but I haven't been given any official reason to think that they're not going ahead. Okay,
but from what you're saying, even if it is going ahead, in terms of what's being delivered in Wales, it very much is the standard free port concept that we had been looking at previously.
Well, I think that the bids are going in at the moment, so the government has taken a flexible approach, and they've even said, in terms of free ports, that there might be room for more than one free port as well if there are a high number of excellent bids. So I think flexibility is the key. I'm just setting out what the general principle is, and something similar could apply to investment zones. But to be fair, I think there is a new government in place. I'm sure the relevant cabinet minister will want to look at all sorts of things before moving ahead with them. And so my focus is very much on bringing a free port, and perhaps even more than one free port, to fruition as soon as possible. And once I have more information about how the government want to take forward investment zones, I would certainly hope we could work with Welsh Government to develop that in Wales. And we've already seen the success of the Deeside industrial area. I've visited there on a number of occasions as the Wales Office Minister, and we've seen what a huge success that has been for the North Wales economy. So if we could replicate that further, then I would be very positive about it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So last week we had a session here looking at the economic potential of floating offshore wind in the Celtic Sea and how that relates to the Welsh economy. We had a number of industry leaders in front of us, and all of them really, including the Crown Estate and also the UK government's own offshore wind champion, Tim Pick, and all of them seem to be singing from a very similar hymn sheet, really speaking up the economic opportunity for Wales. And indeed, Henrik Pedersen, the chief executive of ABP Ports, which owns Port Talbot Port, talked in terms of this being a kind of almost like once in a lifetime, once in a generation economic opportunity for Wales. Is that a view that's shared by yourself, Secretary of State? Do you recognise this as a big prize to go out there and seize for Wales?
Absolutely, Mr Chairman, and you'll be aware I've visited the Pembroke Dock area to look at some of that infrastructure. I believe you were there, present on one of those visits. I think it's an enormous opportunity, very exciting opportunity for us. I mean, I could probably eat at 10 or 15 minutes talking about my enthusiasm for that. We need every single gigawatt of hour of electricity that we can that's produced within this country. There are 5 potential zones out there in the Celtic Sea. One of the first things I've done already as Secretary of State is to meet with the Crown Estates to see how much more quickly we can get a bidding process up and running over those 5 areas, and they're also enthused about it. So the simple answer to your question is yes, I'm enthusiastic. I've already undertaken some work on that, and I look forward to visiting perhaps again in the near future.
Fabulous. That's really encouraging to hear. And your officials hopefully would have followed last week's session where numerous witnesses talked up the importance of the free port concept to help deliver some of these economic opportunities and ensure that there's real economic value held in Wales from doing floating offshore wind at an industrial scale. One more specific question from me, and then I'm going to start to bring in my colleagues, and that relates to the Newport wafer fab business. You'll be aware that the UK government had previously announced a review, given national security concerns around the purchase of Newport wafer fab. The decision on the review, following the review, has been delayed, I think, about 3 times now. Are you able, Secretary of State, to give the committee an idea of why a decision keeps getting delayed?
Well, what I can say to you, Mr. Chairman, on that is I'm very well aware of the issues around this, and I have had a number of briefings on it. Mm-hmm. But obviously there is a national security issue here, and the advice I've had is not to comment further on it, but to say that it is being very carefully looked at the moment by government.
Thank you for that. In terms of the representations we've received, there is a strong concern about the workforce and the uncertainty that's hanging over the workforce in that facility in Newport. And it'd be remiss of me not to ask the question whether you're aware of the feelings of the workforce at the moment and their desire to get some certainty and clarity on the future for the facility there.
I'm fully aware of that, Mr. Chairman. I know there are 200 jobs at risk. I think some of the people who are working there are actually constituents, and so as a constituency MP, I've been contacted by some and also by the union. I'm absolutely aware of it. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to see any jobs being lost anywhere. Yeah. But the process that's taking place has arisen because of national security concerns, and I can confirm I've had briefings about that, and I've been advised not to say anything further.
Yeah, I understand that, and as a committee, we are not in a position to make judgments about the information that will be feeding into the national security side of it. But I think as a committee, we'd probably want to see this issue resolved as efficiently and as quickly as possible.
I share your concern about the jobs, and I've made that known.
Okay, thank you very much. Geraint,
on this issue, would you just accept, other than the security issue, this is a strategic global economic asset that the government should be investing in to grow our economy, as opposed to people feeling, oh, my job might be at risk. We should be going in there, investing, securing it for Britain. Isn't that your position?
Thank you.
Well, I can confirm that obviously compound semiconductors are a very strategic asset, and the government are very well aware of that, and I would agree completely. The ability to produce compound semiconductors is something that is vitally important from a strategic perspective, yes.
Thank you very much. Simon Baines, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Secretary of State. Thank you, Minister, for giving us your time this morning. I'm particularly pleased to see that we now have what I think is the correct balance within the ministerial team of representation from both North Wales and South Wales. Sorry to put it in that order, but as a North Wales MP, I feel very strongly about this. And I feel that North Wales is perpetually underrepresented and underappreciated within the overall system of Wales. So could you, just as a general point to start with, maybe comment, both of you, on ways in which you would want to ensure that North Wales gets its fair share of attention and benefits within Wales overall?
I feel I should hand over to my
Thank you,
colleague.
Simon, for your welcome. I mean, clearly, I'm a minister for the whole of Wales, and that mustn't be forgotten. But equally, as a North Wales MP, as you are, I have my own thoughts about opportunities for the region and risks for the region. And so, for instance, when it comes to transport infrastructure, for instance, you and I know how important that is to North Wales and the importance of plugging into Warrington and Crewe in terms of rail. We also know opportunities for energy, so the nuclear industry in Ynys Môn and Trallsfynydd, possibilities for additional wind power. Clearly, the Celtic Sea has the floating opportunity in southwest Wales, but in North Wales we have a 20-year history of wind power, with more, as you know, being put out at sea. So making the most of that, looking at tidal opportunities as well, something that's really very interesting to me. Plus, of course, the general levelling up agenda and making sure that our communities and seaside towns see the benefit of the government's agenda.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And that actually neatly leads into my second question, which is about transport. My understanding is that the Avanti West Coast franchise has been extended by the UK government until April 2023, unless I'm much mistaken. Clearly there are very, very many problems with the performance of Avanti West Coast within Wales. Could you please comment on how you see that situation and the degree to which you, as the Welsh office, are putting pressure on the Department for Transport to really take a long, hard look at the underperformance of this franchise?
If I may, Mr Baines, this issue was raised in questions to the Wales office approximately a week ago. We'd already been in touch with the Department for Transport. My understanding is that they acknowledged that there have been a number of complaints. I certainly am well aware of them, and that although this franchise has now been extended, that they are looking very carefully at the levels of service being offered. But if you would like, Mr Baines, I'm happy to go and get confirmation of that from officials. But the complaints, the many complaints, have certainly been noted by DFT.
Okay, thank you. And also, Transport for Wales made 2 bids to the Union Connectivity Fund, which sought to improve journey times on South Wales Main Line and enhance infrastructure in the Chester-Cheshire area. What discussions has the Wales office had with the Treasury about the decision to decline both these bids?
Go on, do you want to?
In actual fact, I'm not certain that they have been declined. I think this is an ongoing process, and those bids, as I understand it, are very complementary to other work that's been ongoing. And so certainly Secretary of State and I have work to do to speak to DFT and ensure that wherever possible work is progressed on plans such as those that you highlight.
Yeah, just to confirm, I don't think those bids have been refused at all, and there is an ongoing discussion about them, and an announcement will be made in due course.
Excellent. And again, rail infrastructure is a reserved competence. Or parts of it. So, for instance, I speak parochially here as somebody who's seeking to get step-free access at Rabban Station in my constituency. But as a more broad point, I think from our point of view as a committee, it's very important that the Wales office applies pressure wherever possible to the Department for Transport to actually come through with the funding and the support. And I used a particular example from my constituency, but I know of many other such projects across Wales. So could you comment on that in general, and also on the way in which you interact with other government departments to ensure that we get the best deal possible for Wales?
Okay. I feel there might be a number of slightly different questions there. In respect to the step-free access, my understanding is, although I don't have this in front of me, that is coming out of a separate fund, and that Wales has been given various awards. I believe Abergavenny had one recently, and I'm sure there was, whilst there was input from me as the local MP, each of those bids has to be assessed based on transparent criteria. As far as the overall point about rail infrastructure and spending, the UK government has spent £340 million, or will be spending it during this control period. And obviously some of the improvements that are taking place that are not part of that £340 million will still improve services for Welsh passengers, such as the work that's taking place at the moment in Gloucester, which will have a hugely beneficial impact for travellers going from South Wales up to the Midlands. And the third part of your question is, what is our interaction? Well, we have, I as the Minister in the Wales office, had regular meetings with DFT ministers, the former rail minister and others, and I would certainly expect that to continue.
Okay. And 2 final questions, Chair. First of it is that for in North Wales, obviously the cross-border aspect of our economic and other lives is vital, Mersey-Dee Alliance and so on. And to what extent do you think, as ministers, there's more work that can be done to build those links across borders? I mean, particularly when I think I'm right in saying about 25% of people in Wales actually go across the border each day to a job in England.
Yeah, and perhaps I'll bring my colleague in a minute. I mean, first of all, obviously, I've had certainly a number of meetings with the Mersey-Dee Alliance. I'm happy to continue that relationship. Obviously, I met with the North Wales Growth Board and Ambition Wales on a number of occasions, and hope that will also continue. As you all know, Mr. Baines, there is a potential project in the RNEP, which is improvements to the North Wales coastline. And although I don't want to presume what questions may be asked, I suspect that HS2 may come up at some point in this session. And of course, HS2 is going to improve journey times to London from Crewe, which will also be beneficial to passengers in North Wales. And perhaps I could bring in my
Yes,
colleague.
thank you. I mean, it is critical, as you know, to the region as a whole, and I will have to now relinquish my chairmanship of the APPG that oversees that, and perhaps you could take it over, Simon. That would be a one positive for the region. But the agenda, particularly in relation to rail, is so important, as you know. So I mentioned before Warrington and Crewe. Well, Warrington, of course, is where North Wales would link up with Northern Powerhouse Rail and northbound HS2, and Crewe for southbound HS2. But more than that, regional services, so the fact that you can essentially not use the train effectively to get to Manchester and Liverpool from North Wales, it takes much longer than driving. That is a real problem, and is holding back opportunities for my constituents and yours. So that is absolutely critical, and much of the infrastructure work that needs to take place is not necessarily in Wales. So I know there are bottlenecks at Chester Station, for instance, and electrification clearly needs to ultimately come through from Crewe and Warrington as well. So it is absolutely critical, and merely understanding that fact is a good start in terms of liaising with government and other bodies.
Thank you. My time is just about to be up, but one very quick last question, and you can give a very quick answer to it. Obviously, we have a new administration under the Prime Minister. Can you please confirm unequivocally that the commitment of the UK government to levelling up, this is of vital importance. I think only one substantial levelling up fund has been granted in North Wales, which happens to be in my constituency, but there are many, many people, I mean, across the whole of Wales who are in bad need of such funds. So can you please confirm that the government remains as committed as it did a few months ago to the levelling up agenda?
Yes.
Thank you.
Beautifully succinct. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much, Simon. Ben Lake, please.
Thank you, Chairman. And diolch yn fawr iawn, Sgwynedd Gladwell a Gweinidog. Secretary of State, you mentioned in remarks to the Chair that the Prime Minister expressed a desire to create a good and positive relationship with the Welsh Government. Just quite simply, how do you envision going about fostering such a relationship?
Well, Mr. Lake, as you know, for the last 3 years almost, I've served as the Minister in the Wales office, and during that time I had numerous meetings with Welsh Government ministers, obviously many on to do with COVID, but as the Minister who was responsible for growth deals, I also had a lot of personal meetings with ministers, mainly Vaughan Gethin, sometimes others, when we were on growth deal visits, Mark Drakeford of course as well. And at a personal level there's never been any difficulty in our relationships at all. I think when it comes to something like growth deals, we're all on the same side. We all want to see that investment. We want to see them succeed. And I don't see anything changing. I've spoken to, as I said, I spoke to Mark Drakeford a couple of days ago on another meeting, and I'll be talking to him later on. But one of the first things we did was to try and set that call up. And obviously, he has a very busy diary, so I think this was the first time he was available.
Fantastic, wonderful. The Welsh Government have, however, made some comments recently complaining about the lack of engagement on a number of UK bills. How do you think those sorts of concerns can be addressed in future? And do you envision any sort of circumstance whereby certain UK ministers and other departments may need to foster some sort of a direct relationship with their counterparts in the Welsh Government as well?
I think there have always been direct relationships between Welsh Government and other UK Secretaries of State. I also know that at the official level there's a great deal of work that goes on. Clearly there have been a number of bills, I think it's either 8 or 10, in which LCMs were involved. And the cooperation actually continues, I think, reasonably well. Now, I know there are always going to be tensions, and I pick that up. I read things in the press, and it's to be expected that, if you like, a left-wing government with in coalition with those in favour of independence might have occasionally a slightly different view from a moderate centre-right government in Westminster. But at the personal level, we're all professionals, and we all have a shared interest, and I very much hope that will continue. And the conversations, all the conversations I've had with Mark Drakeford over 3 years have all been perfectly warm, professional. I don't think I've ever fallen out with any Welsh Government minister directly. So I look forward to that continuing.
And in terms then of the future relationship then, what sort of role do you envision the sort of structures of the Interministerial Standing Committee and the Interministerial Finance Committee serving in the future?
Well, those committees are already in place, and I don't know of any plans to change them. I mean, clearly over the last few years, I took part in a lot of those committee meetings myself. They were all online because of COVID, and I often stood in for the Secretary of State when he was doing other things. Now, I mean, we have a new government, and they make a few changes here or there. I'm not aware of any, but I think that you could tell from the fact that one of the first things that the new Prime Minister did was to telephone Mark Drakeford and Nicola Sturgeon. I think it's very, and as I say, it's no secret, he did say to me, I want a good, professional, positive relationship with the devolved administrations. So I doubt very much whether any of these committees are going to be torn up and rejigged in some way that isn't going to be appreciated by Welsh Government. It's very much not the way that the Prime Minister wants to go about things. He wants good, professional, positive relationships with all of the devolved administrations.
And in the past, have these sort of committee meetings been an opportunity to discuss pieces of legislation at the UK level that perhaps the Welsh Government...
Yes, I mean, they absolutely. I mean, I've taken part in a number of the agricultural ones, and sometimes some of the discussions that took place there, some of the comments made by Welsh Government ministers were perhaps not entirely supportive of what the UK government was doing, but that's politics. At least there is that opportunity on those committees to express disagreement, and I'm sure it won't surprise you, Mr. Lake, that disagreement has occasionally, regularly perhaps, been expressed, but it can be discussed in an open way on those committees.
So it wouldn't be the case that in future, if, for example, the Welsh Government refuses to give consent to certain parts of legislation, you would not consider that as necessarily as a failure of the relationship as such, but perhaps more of a function of politics?
Not necessarily. I mean, if you take something like the UKIM bill, I think the UK government felt that essentially, if the Welsh Government, if the legislation hadn't been carried forward, then the Welsh Government would effectively have been, one could argue, able to block important trade bills, which is very much a reserved matter. But at all times, the UK government will be looking to work with Welsh Government to ensure that that we can reach agreement without the need to legislate without LCMs, and show proper respect to a democratically elected body.
If we can move on to a slightly different topic, and I was very heartened to hear you mention in your opening remarks that you want to be Wales's voice in the Cabinet and to ensure that Wales's needs and interests are understood across government. In your opinion, has there been any difficulties in the past, perhaps, with other departments not necessarily appreciating some of the specific circumstances Wales finds itself. There have been, of course, many concerns in the past expressed, but sometimes the devolution settlement is not well understood, and that sometimes can have an impact on decisions made at Whitehall. Do you consider your role to be part educating other departments that the intricacies of the devolution settlement, and as well as championing Wales's
Well,
interest?
I think I can't think of a specific instance off the top of my head, but to be honest with you, I think that probably would have happened. I mean, it's bound to happen that people aren't always going to be aware of the specific cultural and differences that arise in Wales over things like language, for example. So I suppose I will concur with your question that part of the role of the Wales office would be to educate in that sense. Well, I mean, one of the things that I have always sought to do is to meet quickly with ministers from DCMS to explain the importance of Esperarec, of course, and the role that that has in fostering the Welsh language. So whilst I haven't done that in the last week, I can assure you that would be a priority as well, as an example.
Wonderful. And if I may, just you touched on growth deals earlier in the session, and I'm bound to ask what your understanding is of the current situation with the Mid Wales growth deal, and whether you could comment as to whether progress is satisfactory or otherwise.
Mr. Lake, is a very good question indeed, because obviously in the other three growth deal areas, projects are up and running and being developed, and we're not quite there yet with the Mid and West Wales growth deal, and I think again that needs to be a priority for myself and my colleague here. I think it's fair to say that perhaps we're not quite where we want to be in Mid and West Wales yet on growth deals.
And do you think there's has progress changed at all since the local elections this year? Have you found any changes in the dynamic since obviously there's a regime change in
Yes.
Powys?
Well, I suppose it's fair to say that any new set of councillors coming in will have their own priorities and a lot of work to take. And I haven't seen a change. I haven't read. Well, I think I need to talk, and my colleague will want to talk to both of the local authority leaders about how we can help and support them in bringing projects forward quickly. And perhaps, Mr. Lake, you'll have a role in this as well, because I think the last time I came down to visit your local authority leader, you very kindly took me to one or two places yourself. So I would highly recommend another visit to my colleague if he gets the opportunity soon.
You're very welcome.
I mean, I'm advised the Growing Mid Wales Board recommended in September that 6 projects should proceed forward to an outline business case stage, including a green innovation park in Aberystwyth, a bespoke tourist facility in the Elan Valley, and at least 2 projects should be delivered by summer 2023, so that's the ambition.
Oh, thank you. That's good to hear. And yes, the invitation always stands. Thank you, Chair.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ben. Geraint Davies, please.
You, welcome, Secretary of State. I was very pleased that you said, sorry with my voice, but I'm very pleased that you said you'd be a strong voice for Wales in government and you'd be aiming to get as much investment and jobs as we possibly can. With that in mind, you may be aware of the alerts from the Vice-Chancellor of Swansea University, Paul Boyle, about the loss of 50 projects and 270 jobs through the sort of cliff edge lost of European structural funding. And these jobs are very important for green growth and local business. I was wondering whether you'd speak up on that, perhaps meet with me and Swansea University on it as well, and basically champion green jobs and growth and stop those cuts in Wales and further afield than Swansea as well.
Well, I wouldn't recognise that there are going to be cuts in Wales, because obviously all of the money that was coming in from Europe will be replaced by the Shared Prosperity Fund. I have visited Swansea University on a number of occasions as a minister, and I'm happy to do so again. Yeah. To the best of my knowledge, the last time I visited Swansea, I don't recall that particular issue being raised.
Is this being really flagged up as an emergency now?
Right.
Because these projects are on hold, and what's been specifically said is the Shared Prosperity Fund, isn't in place to sort this out, and what they urgently need is bridging funding before the new systems can be put in place, in the hope that these jobs can be continued. You may be aware that a lot of them are at the cutting edge of green growth.
Well, the Shared Prosperity Fund obviously is a matter for DLUC, but having said that, as I've said already, we have a role in making sure that Wales's voice is heard around the cabinet table, and I've written to DLUC already to ask that the progress be made quickly on shared prosperity funds.
And perhaps you can have a word with Grant Chaps as well, who I've already spoken to and has sort of taken interest in this. But if you could fly the flag for Wales, that would be helpful.
I'm sure my officials are taking note of your comments, Mr. Davies, right. And I sense that we might be doing another letter on that specific point with Swansea University when we have a bit more information about it. But we can. I'm very happy to write on that issue. Yeah.
Moving on a similar vein, Welsh Government have decided to give local authorities 3.5% of extra funding, but obviously inflation's running at 10%. I mean, given the profile of Wales as being older and poorer and sicker on average than UK, and average wages are something like 70% of UK average, will you be pressing government to ensure we get our sort of fair share for local authorities to hold up public services which are closer to the level of inflation?
And you'll be aware, Mr. Davies, that we gave a record-breaking increase of £2.5 billion to Welsh Government. What they do with it, obviously, is a matter for them. I'm aware of the concern about inflation, which is running at those sorts of levels across much of Western Europe and the United States at the moment. And whilst I don't sit in the Treasury, I am aware that the Chancellor is going through the figures at the moment and will be doing everything possible on the 17th to ensure that that those areas that perhaps have the most need will get what we can.
In Swansea, by way of example, the energy costs for the local authority alone will go up by 15 million, from 5 to 20 million next year. And for the health service across Wales, energy costs will go up 200 million. So I appreciate you haven't got a money bag sitting beside you, but I mean the issue here is again that Wales has got special needs and our profile is more vulnerable. So will you be sort of working hard to make sure we get our fair share in difficult times?
Yeah, I'll certainly be doing that. Obviously, the NHS and many other public sector organisations have been hit by increases in energy costs, which is why we brought in the guarantee until April. Which will mean that most organisations are only paying half what they would be if the guarantee wasn't there. And clearly that's going to be reviewed before April to see what we can do to make it continue. The problem that we faced, as you know, it's well publicised a month or so ago, was that trying to keep that going for up to 2 years could have cost up to £130 billion, and it would have been very difficult to do that without borrowing at much higher rates of interest. So, as you rightly say, there is no sort of cupboard anywhere in government in Whitehall marked up money with a load of cash in it, and the sums of money that we would need to keep energy at the sort of cost that it was at 18 months or 2 years ago are absolutely immense. But having said all that, we all know this. Of course, I'll be doing everything possible to make sure that Wales continues to get as much money as possible out of Treasury. And under the system that's in place, of course, Wales does get around £1.20 for every £1 spent in devolved areas in England.
You'll be aware that across Wales and across the UK there's problems of children, people in hunger. Yes. The latest figures are 1 in 4 people are in hunger and 1 in 5 children. And in Wales, through the Welsh Government, we've got free school breakfasts and they're rolling out free school lunches. But they haven't got the money, I'm told, for free school lunches, as it were, in the holiday period. You'll remember the campaign of Marcus Rashford and others. Will you be prepared to press government to help Wales get that extra money so poor children in Wales, have that money in the holiday period, because this is a desperate situation now?
Well, obviously, Mr. Davies, you'll be aware that what I can do is try and get money from the UK government to the Welsh government, and the last time around it was an increase by £2.5 billion. What the Welsh government do with that money is entirely a matter for them, and were I to start suggesting that they spend it on this, that or the other in devolved areas, then obviously I would create exactly the sort of which I think I've said that we're hoping to avoid. I am not here to tell Welsh Government how to spend their money. They have they have a large sum of money. They also have tax raising powers, and they have the ability, if they want.
I guess I'm saying they do provide this food for children who are otherwise, hungry at school.
And that's a wonderful thing to do.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because they don't provide that in England. This is the point. And what I would want you to do is to encourage England to provide English children with some food at the start of school, and to provide the money for all of us to have the food rather than it coming out of other pots.
Well, obviously, this is a much wider discussion, isn't it? But clearly one would have to decide whether it's a good idea to provide 1, 2, 3 meals a day every single day of the year to every child in the country, or whether perhaps...
Is that 3? Is 2, yeah.
Well, I don't know. Well, I mean, maybe if 2 were provided, I can guarantee there'll be some people saying, what about dinner? It's a very difficult issue. But the UK government is trying to target help at those who need it the most.
That's right.
And the UK government is also supplying money to the Welsh government. The Welsh government have the freedom, of course, to do what they want to do. They could, if they wanted to, raise taxes and provide as many meals as they wanted to people as often as they wanted, if they thought that was a good use of money.
Tax base, of course, in Wales. And one of the reasons for that is that we haven't got the investment in railways to raise productivity and wages. And you'll know that over the years that Wales has had 1.5% of enhanced rail investment for 5% of the people, and we haven't had our 5% of HS2, which would give us about £5 billion. And I met with you, if you remember, with Professor Mark Barry about this. So will you urge, as Tories in Wales are urging, that Wales gets our fair share, namely our 5% of HS2, so we can provide more productivity and wealth creation in Wales to pay those taxes you want to raise?
I mean, first of all, Mr. Davies, I'm not sure I recognise the 5 billion figure. I mean, 5% is normally what Barnett consequentials mean, is it not? And I think the phase 1 of HS2 is £40 billion.
I think the projected thing is projected as over 100 billion.
I've seen that estimate for the whole thing when it's finally finished, but I mean, between now and 2029, 2030, the cost of phase 1 of HS2, as I understand it, my officials may correct me if I'm wrong, it's not actually a Welsh office matter, but it's around £40 billion. Now, if again, I don't know exactly when work starts.
Fight for the 2 billion.
Well, what I'm about to suggest is based on that's over 10 years or so. So that would be about 200 million a year. I mean, over this control period, £340 million has been spent on rail improvements in Wales. We've had the Core Valley lines, 125 million, £76 million for the electrification of the tunnel, £58 million for Cardiff Central Station. And on top of that,
less than our proportionate share.
Well, actually, if we just leave aside that straightforward spending on rail, we also have to remember that the Cardiff Metro is a light rail system, and that is a match-funded part of the UK government growth deal, and that's worth well over £500 million. So actually, when you start... So I keep hearing Mark, with the greatest respect to Mark Barry, an expert in his field, no doubt, but he keeps banding around this £5 billion figure, and I just don't recognise it. It doesn't bear any relation to the figures that the government are publishing on HS2. But if one takes 5% of 40 billion over 10 years, then one has a figure of 200 million, and I can already point to 340 million of spending over a control period in Wales, plus the Secretary of State, plus the Cardiff Metro, plus the spending that's going on outside of Wales that benefits Welsh passengers, and politely suggest to you as a keen environmentalist that HS2 is there to get people out of there.
Secretary of State, sorry to cut across you, just in terms of timekeeping, we do need to move on to my next colleague. I'm not sure we'll get to the bottom of the funding figures, but maybe we can come back to it on another occasion. So Beth Winter, please.
Llongyfarchiadau ar eich apwyntiad, a diolch yn fawr am ddod heddiw. Really appreciate it. I'm going to quote you now. I don't know if you're aware that the chair of the Welsh Local Government Association over the last week has been highlighting the decimation of public services that are likely to happen over an £800 million black hole. So Andrew Morgan has said, we are clinging to the cliff edge by our fingernails. This won't simply be about cutting services. If there isn't UK government intervention, there will be wholesale closing down of services. Similar to my colleague in Swansea, my local authority is facing a shortfall of between 45 and 47 million pounds next year. And Mr Morgan has said even if we totally cut library, leisure, the bin services, there'll still be millions of pounds of a shortfall. What do you say to the council leaders in Wales?
Well, first and foremost, we're facing very difficult economic times at the moment. As you'll recognise, Miss Winter, we tried to borrow our way out of an energy crisis that's been caused by a war in the Ukraine, and which followed on from a global pandemic, and we found that we weren't able to do that. We simply couldn't borrow that money. That left us that leaves us actually having to make a decision about taxes and spending, and these decisions are going to be difficult. I've not heard Andrew Morgan or anyone else who's made these perfectly valid points actually suggest where extra money could come from to deal with the problems that have arisen. I would say, with the greatest of respect to Mr Morgan, who had a very good positive discussion with informally earlier on, or on the weekend, I think, when we both appeared on a TV programme, that some of the local authorities, RCT might be amongst them, do have large amounts of reserves. Some seem to have a lot more than others. Monmouthshire doesn't have very much at all, but some have quite significant reserves, and this may be the moment to look at that. The other point I'd make, of course, is that it's not down to the UK government to tell the Welsh government exactly how much money to give to each of the 22 local authorities in Wales. That's a matter for the Welsh government to decide. And they did receive an increase of £2.5 billion, and they do have tax-raising powers. And if they think there's a simple way to better fund local authorities, they have the ability to do that themselves, and in fact probably wouldn't welcome me telling them exactly what to do.
You'd be unsurprised that I'm going to challenge you on some of the figures. As a result of inflation, Welsh Government's budget in the 3-year spending round 2022 to 25 is now worth up to £4 billion less in real terms. The budget for 2024-25 would have been £3.5 billion higher if it had increased in line with the economy since 2010. And obviously there's the £1.1 billion in unreplaced funding as a result of us leaving. And these are Welsh Government figures that I'm quoting to you here, not my figures plucked out of the air. And the purse strings lie squarely with UK government. Jeremy Miles has recently said that it's a disgrace the UK government has left us in an impossible situation, and he has assured people in education, workers, that he will continue to work with colleagues to push UK government to provide Wales with a fair funding settlement. Those figures I gave you clearly contradict the figures that you are, or the position that you are relaying to me. What do you say to Welsh Government?
Well, first of all, I haven't seen those figures, but so I'm not able to give a full analysis of them. I mean, I hear you say that Welsh Government is saying that they will lose out as a result of leaving the European Union. I certainly don't recognise that figure. I know that what they have tried to do is to kind of sort of tail on funding that went on beyond the sort of the EU structural fund period, and try and suggest that had we stayed in the EU, they would have got the tail and they would have got a whole load of extra money on top. And that isn't the case, because the EU money doesn't usually start flowing in anyway straight away, whereas the Shared Prosperity Fund money will. So I completely reject the argument about losing out as a result of the European Union, and those figures I have seen previously. I will concede one thing, which is that we, like all other countries in Western Europe and the United States, are facing high levels of inflation at the moment, and that clearly does have an impact. Just gently throwing it back to you, as a political party, the Labour Party, expressed concerns about the government borrowing money, which they tried to do in order to get us through an energy crisis caused by international circumstances. We know that we can't do that, and certainly not paying the levels of interest that we want. We're then left with difficult decisions over spending or taxes. I mean, I haven't heard anyone, with the greatest respect, anyone at all from the Labour Party who's criticised the government over these issues, actually saying where they get the money from. But if you're able to tell me, I'll go back to Treasury with some ideas. I actually led a Westminster Hall debate yesterday, and one of the figures I quoted was Tax Justice UK, who have said only last week that the government could raise up to £37 billion a year by taxing wealth. And I think most people would agree that it was absolutely astonishing that BP recorded 3 months profits of
0.1 billion profits in the last 3 months. Can I move on quickly to other questions? Sorry.
Very quickly.
One, today we are being lobbied, all parliamentarians, by trade unions who are coming to Westminster today. Will you meet the trade unions who are coming up from Wales today?
I'm meeting one of my constituents who is representing that trade union, and I'm meeting him at 11:30, and then I'll be going off after that to call the First Minister and then to attend an event in Cardiff. So it's already happening.
Do you agree that the public sector workers deserve an inflation-proof pay rise?
I'd love to see everyone getting inflation-proof pay rises if, in an ideal world. And again, if we could find the money, I'm sure that's what we'd all want to see that happen. It's not a case of anyone in government wanting people not to have inflation-proof pay rises. It's a matter of facing very difficult decisions that we have to in times of an economic crisis, and that's why I'm confident that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister will be looking at making sure the most vulnerable have the help targeted at them.
People on benefits?
Well, again, I know the Chancellor, he's a very compassionate man, and I know that he will want to support those who are the least well off and to target what help we can at those who are the most vulnerable, and that is quite right what we should be doing.
My final question, sorry, very quickly. You have been recorded in previous years as being a bit of a climate sceptic in quotes that I've seen. But it's gone back a few years. It is an issue that is very, very close to my heart. We've had climate assemblies in my constituency. We've got a climate ministry now in Wales. Can you give me some reassurances that you do accept that we are facing an existential crisis in terms of the climate and that you will champion the issue of climate change in your role?
Well, first of all, I've spoken on this issue on a number of occasions over probably 10 or 12 years, and I think on virtually every occasion I've made the point that CO2 is a global warming gas. We've been emitting a lot of it ever since the Industrial Revolution, and therefore it's had an effect on climate. So I think I've looked back at various speeches I've made, and that's always been very clear. So I haven't changed my view. Carbon dioxide is definitely a global warming gas, and it's having an impact on the climate, as I've said many times over the last 10 years. I know that at least one journalist who seems to have a personal animus towards me for some reason in Wales seems to have spent an unhealthy amount of his time trawling through every single speech I've ever made on anything to see if he can pluck things out and find things to have a go at. And to his, he celebrated the fact that he managed to find one speech or one article somewhere online where this wasn't clear, came back to me, and I took it down when I eventually found it. But I've already said to you, on things like the floating offshore wind, I'm hugely in favour of it. Things like nuclear energy, of course, which we haven't talked about, be hugely in favour of that, which also creates large amounts of baseload electricity without creating carbon dioxide emissions. And you yourself, Ms. Winter, have just made a very strong point about the cost of living crisis, the cost of energy, which we're all facing, the impact that's having on the public sector, amongst other things. And so I hope you would also agree with me that we need to do everything we can to make sure that energy is as cheap as possible for people.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Beth. Virginia Crosby, please.
Thank you, Chair, and croeso, and thank you both for coming to my Anglesey Skills Day in Westminster on Monday. My first question relates to St David's Day. So what assessments have you made of the potential effect of the Welsh economy and tourism industry of denoting St David's Day to actually be a bank holiday?
Well, Mr. Crosby, first of all, thank you very much indeed for the event you organised. It's wonderful to see that. As far as the argument about St David's Day is concerned, clearly bank holidays do have a cost. I think there's been a suggestion that one might want to move one bank holiday to another, possibly May Day, the festival to celebrate international socialism, might be moved to March the 1st to celebrate St David's Day. That isn't the government policy at the moment. I have to say, there are some issues where I feel very strongly. There are others where I'm rather more relaxed. This isn't something I'd be ever stamping out of cabinet over, whatever happened. I accept the government position as it is, and I also would say that on balance I support it, because actually I think there are some advantages to having not having a bank holiday. And that I have 3 children who all went to a state school in South Wales. They always used to sort of celebrate St David's Day in school. I think I was in there a few times to watch some dancing and singing and stuff. And I suspect that had they not been in school, rather than celebrating this wonderful part of Welsh culture and enjoying a little bit of the language and the dancing, there might have been a tendency to flop down on a sofa and mess around with a PlayStation, and I'd much rather they be celebrating Welsh culture. So on balance, I'm happy with things as they are. I'm happy with our children celebrating St David's Day in school. If that policy changes at some time in the future, well, I'd look for other ways to try and ensure that our culture is celebrated.
Thank you. The number of MSs in Wales are due to go from 60 to 96, so one MS will be responsible for around 53,000 constituents, and in terms of NPs, that would equate to 103,000 constituents. There's an estimated cost of £100 million for this increase. Have you had any discussions with the Welsh Government about this, and where will the £100 million actually come from?
Well, Mr. Crosby, it's a very interesting question indeed, that, and I might be tempted. I'm sure I'd be tempted to ask it of the First Minister, but perhaps that might not kick off the relationship that we're looking for straight away. It's not really a matter for me what if the Welsh Government decide they want to spend £100 million during a cost of living crisis on creating extra members of the Senedd. But I must observe one thing, which is that when I got in, I was first elected to the Senedd in 1999, and one of the advantages, which even I acknowledged as somebody who'd at that time recently been in a campaign against having a Welsh Assembly, was that it was easier to get hold of a Senedd member who was in Cardiff and near to a constituency than a member of Parliament sometimes. So one of the issues here is that I think that the direct link with constituencies is going to be completely broken as a result of the plans that are being brought forward. But clearly, it's a matter for the Welsh Government. I'm just surprised that they don't want to put it to a referendum and see if the public will support it or not.
Thank you. And it's great to hear that you're a supporter and a fan of nuclear. My question relates to the Welsh Labour Government has a cooperation agreement with Plaid, and Adam Price has said, we're a party that does not believe in nuclear, we do not support nuclear power, it is the wrong answer. So how practically can we therefore get nuclear investment into Wales, given the cooperation agreement with Plaid, who do not support nuclear?
Obviously, Mr Lake isn't here now to speak for Plaid coming on that issue. I mean, look, I can only say we're 100% in favour of nuclear, and I, as Welsh Secretary, am hugely enthusiastic about nuclear coming to Wilver, to Ynys Môn, and also SMRs coming to Trowse Fynydd. Within those areas, as far as I can see, there is cross-party support. So what is interesting, perhaps, is that whilst some parties nationally may take a view that they're against nuclear power, where a nuclear power station is being proposed, those very same political parties are all in favour of it, which actually goes to show why, I think nuclear power is one of the answers to the energy crisis that we're facing at the moment, and I hope all members of the Welsh Affairs Select Committee might agree.
Thank you. You mentioned the £18 billion record funding to Welsh Government in 2021, and that was equivalent of £120 per person in Wales, and would be £100 per person from the UK Government in England. You also mentioned that in terms of the distribution of that, it is a matter for them. My concern relates to healthcare, in terms of A&E targets, in terms of we've got waiting times for treatment, ambulance waiting times, which are significantly worse than in England and Wales compared to the rest of the UK. Where is the accountability? Where is the accountability for this £18 billion?
Again, it's a very good question, but probably one which, the question as to why it is that when Wales is getting more money per head, £1.20 per head being spent or being given to Wales in devolved areas for every pound being spent in England, it's quite hard to understand why it is we have longer waiting lists, less access to ambulances than patients in England. Why so many patients in Wales actually want to be treated in England. These are all very interesting questions. Difficult for me to understand the answers to, but unfortunately they're not questions which I'm in a position to be able to answer. They should be directed towards Welsh Government ministers.
Got two quick questions.
And by the way, my colleague probably...
Oh, sorry.
Well, I think what I would add Secretary of State is that one of the benefits of devolution was to be that we could compare different policies across the United Kingdom to see which are most effective. So I'm very much of the opinion that openness and transparency and comparison over performance and outcomes is really important, because it helps the democratic choice that our voters have and also helps drive up standards. So that's what I would be looking to push.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is on free ports. There's going to be at least one free port in Wales. I understand there's 4 free ports have shown expressions of interest, and the deadline, as you said, is the 24th of November. You talked about the 26 million for the first one. How will it work practically for the second one? Does that mean actually liaising with Treasury? What will be your involvement there? What will be Welsh Government involvement?
The only information I can give you about that is that the government would take a flexible approach if there are a number of good bids towards a second free port, but I'm not in a position to say what, if any, extra funding might be available to get that up and running.
Thank you. And then the last question, you talked about targeted help. We've of course got the budget on the 17th of November. Here in Wales, we've talked about the cost of living, very rural communities. Many of the businesses and homes are rely on off-grid energy for heating, and whilst the £100 is welcome, it's simply as we're going into a cold winter. What conversations have you had with Treasury to really make sure that you fight on behalf of our communities?
I haven't directly had any meetings with Treasury since being appointed, but obviously I've attended Cabinet, and I don't want to give away any details of what was being discussed, except I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister has made very, very clear that we should be targeting all help at the least well off. And if we look at the Prime Minister's record as Chancellor, that was always the case. That's why we had the £650 payment to people on benefits, £300 to pensioners, £150 for those who are disabled. It was a Chancellor who brought in the furlough scheme, which supported millions of jobs and millions of people who were self-employed all the way through the COVID crisis. So he has a very, very strong record of targeting help at those who need it, targeting it at the least well off, and I'm sure that approach will continue and will be seen in when the statement comes out.
Yes, I mean, I could come in also. I've had similar concerns clearly with rural constituents. I think it's important to remember that virtually everyone has an electricity contract, and therefore they do benefit from the energy bill support scheme, the £400, in addition to the energy price guarantee on electricity. When it comes to alternative fuels, I believe the increase in cost of natural gas for those on the grid, once the energy price guarantee has been factored in over the last year, is 130%. The equivalent figure for oil is 147%, so the £100 makes the difference between 130 and 147, bringing the 147 down to 130. But I think it's really important that the cost of oil and other alternative fuels is monitored closely, because clearly if they go up more than natural gas, then that figure may need to be re-examined.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Before I bring in Wayne Davies, can I just press you on that issue, if I may, Dr. Davies? Are you therefore saying, with that explanation that you've just given to committee, that you believe the £100 for customers off-grid, and 57% of homes in Pembrokeshire don't have access to mains gas? So this is a really live issue for them. Are you saying that you believe the £100 is adequate and that's an appropriate amount?
I think the point is that those who are off-grid have always paid more, haven't they? So the Department Bays has not been trying to bring the cost down to match that of natural gas. Yeah. And their argument is that, yes, it is fair, and the statistics that I have claim to prove that, and certainly I'd be happy to share those if it helps.
Obviously, we accept, though, that there are many people in rural areas off-grid who are suffering at the moment, and I'm sure that is something Treasury will want to look at. We're not really in a position to say what help may or may not be given, but I mean, one immediate thing that could be done to support those in rural areas would be for Welsh Government to re-evaluate the local government funding formula, which actually seems to benefit people in local authorities with urban areas, and not in rural areas. So that's an example of one thing that actually could be done to support those.
I've just made the point. I've got a lot of constituents at the moment trying to get ready for winter, being told that they have to order a minimum amount of 500 litres of heating oil and these people don't have £500 in cash to hand to be able to buy heating oil. So I'll just leave that thought with you. Wayne David, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations, Secretary of State, on your appointment. Could I just begin by making a comment regarding HS2? I mean, this committee prepared a report last year.
Yeah.
The leader of the Welsh Conservatives has made a comment that if there was a realisation that HS2 is an English-only project, which it is in reality, you know that, if it is categorised as that, there'd be a barnett consequential of Wales of £5 billion or perhaps slightly less. You can't get away from that fact, can you?
I can't get away from the fact that if it was classified as an English-only project, there would be a barnett consequential, which would be about 5%. Yeah. No, I mean, that is correct.
In other words, the government is shortchanging Wales for not accepting that obvious categorisation, that objective reality.
Well, not necessarily. Well, first of all, I don't recognise a £5 billion figure, because that would be suggesting, £100 billion, and that would be over a period of many years, because phase one is due to run up until about 2029, 2030, and dare I say it, the way things are with construction projects like that, I wouldn't be confident that it's going to necessarily finish exactly on the day.
Okay, then we say slightly less, but nevertheless the point is still there.
Well, quite significantly less, because if you took that as an annual, if we took £40 billion, which is the presumed figure for phase one, and then we took that over a 10-year period, that would be £200 million a year. So that would be, that would be the sort of figure we're talking about. Now, £2.5 billion is what the uplift was for the Welsh Government last year. So that's obviously more than 10 times 200 million. The other issue is that the UK government are spending a lot of money on the rail network in Wales. It was 340 million over that control period. There are projects in RNEP which may come forward. It is basically...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you've said all this before. I mean, yes. Your argument is basically angels in the head of a pin. What I'm saying to you is that Wales would have had more money if the government had accepted the reality. But HS2 is an English-only project. That is true, isn't it?
Well, it's a fact. You're correct, Mr. David. It is obviously a fact that if any project is accepted as English-only...
We go on to the next question. You've answered that.
Then there is a barnett consequential. So, yes, you're factually correct in that sense.
That's it.
Yeah.
We are correct and you are wrong. Thank you very much indeed. If I could go on to the issue of the cost of living. I'm sure you've seen it, but the Bevan Foundation prepared an excellent report in July of this year. And one of the things they said, and I quote exactly, more than half of people in households with an income of less than £70,000 report that they had a cutback on their heating, electricity and or water. And the likelihood is that things are going to get a lot worse during the next few months. You've already said that you are keen for resources to be targeted on the less well-off people, and that is absolutely necessary. But could I ask you specifically, what representations are you therefore making to the Chancellor on what the specific policies should be?
I haven't spoken to the Chancellor yet in this current role, but there have been discussions in Cabinet, and all I will say is there is a very clear feeling that targeted help needs to go to the most vulnerable. That is a government view, and I believe that the current Prime Minister's previous role as Chancellor underlined his own commitment towards targeting help at the most vulnerable. So I can't go through those books myself. The Chancellor of the Exchequer will be coming out with a statement on the 17th of November, but I'm confident that he will target all the help we can at the least well-off, and rightly so.
Thank you for that, and I hope you're correct. But could I say a number of your colleagues have said that with regard to the increase in benefits, the increase should be keeping up with inflation rather than earnings. Is that your view?
In an ideal world, of course, that's what I would like to see happen. We're not living in an ideal world at the moment, and I don't know what we're going to be able to afford to do. I mean, Mr. David, you I think, being in government, you'll be well aware of the difficulties that any government faces at a time like this. There is a limit in the amount of money that we can spend. We've already discovered we can't borrow money, or we can't borrow in the amounts that we'd like, at the levels of interest that we want. That leaves only two alternatives, which are either putting up taxes, but I don't believe it is your policy set to support tax increases, or cuts to spending. So what the Chancellor is going to have to do is look very carefully and be very, very clever, basically, in how we spend the limited amount of money we have. And I think you would find that we're probably both on the same side in wanting that help targeted at the most vulnerable. But it's not. Is it necessarily responsible, sir, to keep, not that you're doing this, to call for more money for this? What you're saying, inflation-busting pay rises, more money for every public service. But no, we don't want extra taxes, and no, we don't want to borrow the money.
You've answered the question. What you're saying is true, of course. We have to make sure that everything is properly costed, yes. But nevertheless, there's a contradiction, isn't it, between what you're saying there and what you were saying earlier about one of the principles. But help must be targeted on those who need it most. And I'm asking you specifically, one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that benefits are increased with inflation. That's a sure way to do it.
Well, that would be a short way to help people. But I mean, I don't know what is affordable and what isn't at the moment. I know that is what the government would want to do if they possibly can.
Would you be in favour then of ensuring that that happens? There's the introduction of a special tax on non-dom status. Clear choice.
I can't start giving you answers to what specific taxes the government may need to bring in order to fund help for the most vulnerable. But with the greatest respect, sir, I've heard members of your party already today saying that every person who works in the public sector, which I presume includes even MPs, should have an inflation-busting pay rise. I mean, I can understand the argument for those on lower wages to have pay rises, but there are a lot of people in the public sector who are earning as much as the Prime Minister or more. I mean, is it, are we saying they should all of us have inflation-busting pay rises because we're in the public sector? What about those in the private sector on low wages?
I'd love to answer your question, but we're not in government yet. If I could go on, please, to the Shared Prosperity Fund.
Yes.
I mean, that's obviously an important initiative the government has taken to largely, you would argue, replace Wales's European funding. But we've heard from local authorities, and they're very critical of a number of aspects of the Shared Prosperity Fund. One of the biggest concerns is that the timescale is such that local government have been given impossible deadlines to meet in terms of coming forward with projects which would qualify for support. So can I ask you, why have you determined those tight timescales? And could I say that if local authorities are in a position where, according to your timescale, they're not able to use all the money that's been allocated to them, will that money stay with them and there be a carryover, or will it go back to the Treasury?
Well, first of all, my understanding is that the 4 lead local authorities for Wales have already submitted their regional investment plans, which are being looked at by DLUC. Anecdotally, I've spoken to various local authority leaders over the last 12 months at different times, and they've all told me informally that they're very happy to be having a direct relationship with the UK government, and feel very positive about that. As to whether or not, if there is an underspend, any of that money will go back to Treasury, I'm looking. I don't actually have that information in front of me. My thinking is it probably would, but I don't see any reason. That's because I think I've read that elsewhere. But
that's an extremely important point.
I will.
You really want to be
briefed on that. Any confirmation from officials on that, and I will absolutely write to you. I believe it probably will. But yes, exactly, if there are projects which are ready to go, I can't understand why local authorities, who, as you've just said, are all saying rightly how difficult things are economically at the moment, why would they underspend that money?
But I mean, there's a suspicion, and I put it more strongly about that. But the government has deliberately concocted this process to ensure that local authorities, although it looks good on paper, they've been allocated large sums of money, in practice are not able to spend it. And the government is using this as a smokescreen, basically to retain funds which should be going to local authorities.
Well, Mr. David, I have an answer for you.
Oh, good.
As things happen.
Very briefly then.
The 3-year underfunding period for the UK Shared Prosperity Funds ends in 2025. No funding will be provided for activity after 31st of March 2025, and the expectation is that any further underspends in the final year of the programme will be paid to DLUC. So I think the answer to your question is that if the underspend goes as far as the year 24-25, it would be paid back. So I would hope, now that we know that, all local authorities putting in bids will want to ensure that there are no underspends, because it's not my role to get money from Wales into the Treasury.
Absolutely
it's my
not.
role to get money from Treasury into Wales.
That's
I'm
right.
very clear about that.
I would very much hope that the gun that's being placed to the head of local authorities will be put back.
Well, I'm sure local authorities will now have heard this. If they didn't know it already, they'll all be making absolutely certain there are no underspends, and I will cheer them on as they put that money to good use.
And I would hope
And
that
look
the
forward to
government
visiting.
is more flexible, ensuring the principle of spending money is upheld.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Wayne David, on that note of clarity. Rob Roberts, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, gentlemen. I get the dubious honour of going last and mopping up questions that will follow on from things that you've already answered. I also went on my social media a couple of days ago and said that you were coming and asked constituents if they were sat here what they might ask you. So I've got a couple of those as well, just to channel my inner Corbyn in this process. Yeah. So we'll start off with devolution and intergovernmental relations generally. In response to Ms Crosby earlier on, when she asked about the going from 60 to 96 members of the Senate, you said it's not a matter for me. I'm going to say that it is, because we're not talking about what happens in devolution. We're talking about the nature of devolution itself. Mm-hmm. Now, the Senate was established with 60 members and a hybrid voting system. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that a change to the structure and the voting system should go back to the people for approval over whether they want to spend that extra £100 million?
If you're asking me personally, Mr Roberts, I think that would be a fair thing to do, but it's not my role as Secretary of State to advise the Welsh Government on how they should reconfigure devolution. But I am surprised that, given that there was a second referendum over tax-raising powers, in which people voted, by the way, for tax-raising powers, and as a Democrat who always believes in supporting the result of referendums, no matter what they're on, I absolutely support the fact that the Welsh Government have got tax-raising powers, but I'm surprised that such a big change has taken place without further consultation with the public.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the sentiment. Last week I attended the Interparliamentary Forum in Cardiff with members of the Senedd, Holyrood and the House of Lords. The overwhelming concern from the other legislatures is around, in terms of intergovernmental relations, around the Sewell Convention and legislative consent motions. With regard to Sewell, firstly, do you agree that wording like the UK government will not normally is a little bit too woolly? And does that perhaps need to be codified in order to provide a bit more certainty and a little bit less animosity between the governments?
We don't want to see animosity, but I think the wording is okay, isn't it? I mean, the UK government would not normally want to legislate without the full support of the Welsh government. I mean, that's a reasonable position to take. I mean, it suggests that we
isn't it too easy for the UK government to then say, yeah, but these aren't normal times? And that's a subjective thing, right?
I mean, if we take something like UKIM, I think the point the UK government were making was that had they not legislated, effectively, we would have been handing the Welsh Government, I suppose, control over a major aspect of foreign affairs, which is the ability to strike trade deals, and that would have given the Welsh Government powers that go far beyond what anyone had agreed in any referendum. So I believe there were either 8 or 10 bills that went through with LCM, so basically the vast majority of them were all sorted out perfectly constructively, and there are conversations going on all the time between officials in both Welsh Government and UK Government to make sure that things can get sorted out.
With regard to the LCM process, there seemed to be a general consensus among the other legislatures that the engagement on those seems to come reasonably late in the day quite often, and that it means that they have to then scramble to pull things together quickly, which leads to a bit of wasted resources. Do you agree that perhaps there should be a standard time limit allowed?
Well, I think that's a good idea. I mean, I haven't heard that put before, but it doesn't entirely surprise me. But I don't think one should read too much in the way of conspiracy into any of that. I just think it is the case that there have been many occasions, dare I say, when I've, as a minister, been handed papers rather later than perhaps I would have liked, and I believe that that's a problem that many people have raised over the years. I'm sure that officials do work very hard to try and make sure that the consultation takes place in good time, and I'm sure they will have heard your comments, Mr. Robertson, and taken note.
Appreciate that. I'll come to the first of my guest questions now. I have a question from Andrew, who was an assistant head teacher in my constituency. He said, given the differences with the demographics in Wales, do you believe that the Barnett formula, which was a temporary measure many years ago, remains the best funding formula for Wales to reach its potential?
Well, currently, as Ms Crosby has said, Wales is getting £1.20 for every pound that's spent in devolved areas, so we're doing quite well out of things at the moment. And my worry might be that if we went back to the drawing board and came up with a completely different formula, there is, of course, a possibility that Wales could end up getting significantly less than it does at the moment.
Completely appreciate that. It's been something that's been looked at over decades. I want to turn to cost of living and economy type questions. Another Andrew, a different Andrew, who runs a local caravan park, wants to know whether you think that the tourism tax is a regressive step for Wales or whether it will be useful.
I think the tourism tax is an incredibly bad idea for the tourism industry. It means that, particularly, even more so perhaps in border areas, where people have a choice of going to, for example, to either Monmouth or the Forest of Dean in my own part of the world, there's going to be a financial incentive to go to the Forest of Dean rather than coming and staying in Monmouthshire. And I think we'll see that all the way up the Welsh border and perhaps beyond. And it's a great shame.
It's indeed.
A matter for the Welsh Government, of course, not for me.
I think there's an issue on tourism, actually. I've certainly had many constituents with holiday lets who've been extremely concerned that they've been categorised because they haven't been able to let out their property for the sufficient number of days due to the Welsh Government's own lockdown rules, and are now being penalised in retrospect by having to pay council tax at an inflated rate. So that's another aspect whereby tourism needs a voice.
Yes, indeed. Regarding cost of living more generally, you answered questions from my colleague Mr. David earlier on regarding uprating of benefits by inflation. But he did mention pensions and the triple lock. Now, do you agree that pensions should be increased in line with inflation?
In an ideal world, that's absolutely what I would agree. In an ideal world, I want to see pensions benefits, public sector pay, and the pay of anyone, particularly on lower wages, increasing in line with inflation or even beyond. That's what I would like in an ideal world, yes. But we're not in an ideal world.
Indeed, we're not. But given that we're not sure whether there'll be uprating of benefits, and you talked about people on low incomes, there's also talk of freezing the income tax thresholds for longer, so that people will end up paying more tax by stealth almost. Do you agree that that's an appropriate policy in such difficult times?
I mean, you'll be aware, Mr. Robertson, I'm sure actually everyone around in this room is aware, that I do not know the specifics of what's going to come out in the financial statement. I doubt whether I'll be told in advance, maybe, but if so, it'll probably only be a few hours in advance, if at all. I'm sure I'll learn about it at the same time as everyone else. I can only say to you that I know that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, I know them to be compassionate men who are acutely aware of the need to target all possible help at the least well off, and by that I mean those on benefits, pensioners, those who are disabled. And I just don't know what they're going to do. Even if I did know, I wouldn't be able to say so at this meeting, but I genuinely do not know, and I think you'll appreciate I do not know. The Secretary of State for Wales is not going to be given advance notice of what's going to go into the budget. I do know there are going to be some difficult decisions, because we all accept the financial problem that we face, and it's not one that the UK government have brought about, but it is going to mean some difficult decisions, and I don't know exactly where those decisions are going to affect people.
Just as I come towards the end of my question, I just want to pick up on something that the Chair mentioned earlier on regarding lower-income households and regarding off-grid households. Do you think that the support for off-grid households is enough?
Well, I think £100 was certainly not generous, given the circumstances. And I accept the argument that in general those who are on network gas will have seen much steeper rises in percentage terms than those who are off grid. But nonetheless, everyone has seen huge rises in costs, and I don't feel that £100 was overly generous, and I'm sure that's another matter that the government will be looking at.
Given that's a relatively larger demographic in Wales compared to the rest of the country, I would assume, what kind of representations as Secretary of State for Wales are you able to make, or are you making, to get that changed?
Well, I will make a representation about that, given the percentage size in Wales of people who are off grid. But I believe the government are already well aware of it. I mean, it doesn't just affect Wales; it affects people in rural areas across the whole of the United Kingdom.
I have one quick.
You're super quick, Rob.
Super quick. Just following on from the Share Prosperity Fund question earlier on. They were expected to receive their answers, the local authorities, in October as regard to whether their plans were acceptable. Have they received their responses? And if not, when can they expect to receive the responses, and when will the funds be released?
Well, we have already been in touch with DLUC to express our view that it is important that question be answered as quickly as possible. So it's not actually a matter for me, but for my colleague in DLUC, and as soon as I have an answer, I'll be happy to share it with the committee.
I think the end of this calendar year has been given as a cut-off date for that.
There's a slippage in. There's a slippage.
Thank you very much, Rob. Now, Geraint, you had a very quick supplementary as well, didn't you?
Yeah, throughout this hearing you've mentioned that Wales gets £1.20 per head instead of £1 for England. Would you accept that that's because the demography of Wales is poorer and sicker and older, and therefore we need more money, and in fact relative to Scotland it's not generous at all? Or are you saying we should have some sort of poll tax where everyone gets to pay the same irrespective of need? Is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't read too much into the comment, Mr Davies. I'm just making the point that Wales actually receives more money per head for public spending than England, which is why, as I said, I'm surprised sometimes that public services do not seem to be offered at the same level. Well, the Welsh Government are getting more, but not delivering as much. So we have lower educational standards, according to the independent peace report, lower health standards. I'd love to answer the question, but I have to go and meet my union representative in 3 minutes, and I'm sure Ms Winter wouldn't want me to be late, and she's very welcome to come and say hello as well if she wishes.
I've got many constituents coming up myself.
Secretary of State.
I can't ask one.
Sorry, Geraint, we are running out of time. We are very clear with
just talking rubbish.
Sorry, Geraint, thank you. Secretary of State, thank you very much for your time. Parliamentary Under Secretary of State, Dr James Davies, thank you as well. Can I finish with one quick question? When Virginia Crosby asked you about the issue of St David's Day bank holiday, you said that it's an issue that you probably wouldn't stamp out of Cabinet over.
Correct.
What is an issue that you would leave Cabinet over?
Mr Chairman, I've only been a Minister for a week or so, and given the superb Prime Minister we've got, I cannot imagine that there'll be any issue at all that will lead me to want to walk away from such a fantastic Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And look, Secretary of State, we look forward to welcoming you back very soon, hopefully. There's lots and lots of issues that are of, as you can see, of direct relevance to us and our constituents, and we do value the opportunity to discuss them further with you. But on that note, we'll bring the meeting to a close. Order.
Very good.
Go and meet the unions now.
Proceeding has ended. The 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 proceeding has ended.